Welcome to the BookCast YouTube channel. Today, the audiobook of Fyodor Dostoevsky's The Possessed, another name for the Devils, Part 1 is with you. You can subscribe to our channel to listen to more audiobooks and like our video to support us. Let's start our audiobook without making you wait too long. Some details of the biography of that highly respected gentleman Stepan Trofimovich Verhovensky. In undertaking to describe the recent and strange incidents in our town, till lately wrapped in uneventful obscurity, I find myself forced in absence of literary skill to begin my story rather far back, that is to say, with certain biographical details concerning that talented and highly esteemed gentleman, Stepan Trofimovich Verhovensky. I trust that these details may at least serve as an introduction, while my projected story itself will come later. I will say at once that Stepan Trofimovich had always filled a particular role among us, that of the progressive patriot, so to say, and he was passionately fond of playing the part, so much so that I really believe he could not have existed without it. Not that I would put him on a level with an actor at a theater, God forbid, for I really have a respect for him. This may all have been the effect of habit, or rather, more exactly of a generous propensity he had from his earliest years for indulging in an agreeable daydream in which he figured as a picturesque public character. He fondly loved, for instance, his position as a persecuted man and, so to speak, an exile. There is a sort of traditional glamour about those two little words that fascinated him once for all and, exalting him gradually in his own opinion, raised him in the course of years to a lofty pedestal very gratifying to vanity. In an English satire of the last century, Gulliver, returning from the land of the Lilliputians where the people were only 3 or 4 inches high, had grown so accustomed to consider himself a giant among them, that as he walked along the streets of London he could not help crying out to carriages and passers-by to be careful and get out of his way for fear he should crush them, imagining that they were little and he was still a giant. He was laughed at and abused for it, and rough coachmen even lashed at the giant with their whips. But was that just? What may not be done by habit? Habit had brought Stepan Trofimovich almost to the same position, but in a more innocent and inoffensive form, if one may use such expressions, for he was a most excellent man. I am even inclined to suppose that towards the end he had been entirely forgotten everywhere, but still it cannot be said that his name had never been known. It is beyond question that he had at one time belonged to a certain distinguished constellation of celebrated leaders of the last generation, and at one time, though only for the briefest moment, his name was pronounced by many hasty persons of that day almost as though it were on a level with the names of Chatadev, of Byelinsky, of Granovsky, and of Herzen, who had only just begun to write abroad. But Stepan Trofimovich's activity ceased almost at the moment it began, owing, so to say, to a vortex of combined circumstances. And would you believe it? It turned out afterwards that there had been no vortex and even no circumstances, at least in that connection. I only learned the other day to my intense amazement, though on the most unimpeachable authority, that Stepan Trofimovich had lived among us in our province not as an exile as we were accustomed to believe, and had never even been under police supervision at all. Such is the force of imagination! All his life he sincerely believed that in certain spheres he was a constant cause of apprehension, that every step he took was watched and noted, and that each one of the 3 governors who succeeded one another during 20 years in our province came with special and uneasy ideas concerning him, which had, by higher powers, been impressed upon each before everything else, on receiving the appointment. Had anyone assured the honest man on the most irrefutable grounds that he had nothing to be afraid of, he would certainly have been offended. Yet Stepan Trofimovich was a most intelligent and gifted man, even, so to say, a man of science, though indeed, in science, well, in fact he had not done such great things in science. I believe indeed he had done nothing at all. But that's very often the case, of course, with men of science among us in Russia. He came back from abroad and was brilliant in the capacity of lecturer at the university, towards the end of the 40s. He only had time to deliver a few lectures, I believe they were about the Arabs. He maintained, too, a brilliant thesis on the political and Hanseatic importance of the German town Hanau, of which there was promise in the epoch between 1413 and 1428, and on the special and obscure reasons why that promise was never fulfilled. This dissertation was a cruel and skillful thrust at the Slavophiles of the day, and at once made him numerous and irreconcilable enemies among them. Later on, after he had lost his post as lecturer, however, he published, by way of revenge, so to say, and to show them what a man they had lost, in a progressive monthly review, which translated Dickens and advocated the views of George Sand, the beginning of a very profound investigation into the causes, I believe, of the extraordinary moral nobility of certain knights at a certain epoch or something of that nature. Some lofty and exceptionally noble idea was maintained in it, anyway. It was said afterwards that the continuation was hurriedly forbidden and even that the Progressive Review had to suffer for having printed the first part. That may very well have been so, for what was not possible in those days? Though, in this case, it is more likely that there was nothing of the kind, and that the author himself was too lazy to conclude his essay. He cut short his lectures on the Arabs because, somehow and by someone, probably one of his reactionary enemies, a letter had been seized giving an account of certain circumstances, in consequence of which someone had demanded an explanation from him. I don't know whether the story is true, but it was asserted that at the same time there was discovered in Petersburg a vast, unnatural, and illegal conspiracy of 30 people which almost shook society to its foundations. It was said that they were positively on the point of translating Fourier. As though of design a poem of Stepan Trofimovitch's was seized in Moscow at that very time, though it had been written 6 years before in Berlin in his earliest youth, and manuscript copies had been passed round a circle consisting of 2 poetical amateurs and 1 student. This poem is lying now on my table. No longer ago than last year I received a recent copy in his own handwriting from Stepan Trofimovitch himself, signed by him, and bound in a splendid red leather binding. It is not without poetic merit, however, and even a certain talent. It's strange, but in those days, or to be more exact, in the 30s, people were constantly composing in that style. I find it difficult to describe the subject, for I really do not understand it. It is some sort of an allegory in lyrical dramatic form, recalling the second part of Faust. The scene opens with a chorus of women, followed by a chorus of men, then a chorus of incorporeal powers of some sort, and at the end of all a chorus of spirits not yet living but very eager to come to life. All these choruses sing about something very indefinite, for the most part about somebody's curse, but with a tinge of the higher humor. But the scene is suddenly changed. There begins a sort of festival of life at which even insects sing. A tortoise comes on the scene with certain sacramental Latin words, and even, if I remember aright, a mineral sings about something that is a quite inanimate object. In fact, they all sing continually, or if they converse, it is simply to abuse one another vaguely, but again with a tinge of higher meaning. At last the scene is changed again, a wilderness appears, and among the rocks there wanders a civilized young man who picks and sucks certain herbs. Asked by a fairy why he sucks these herbs, he answers that, conscious of a superfluity of life in himself, he seeks forgetfulness, and finds it in the juice of these herbs, but that his great desire is to lose his reason at once, a desire possibly superfluous. Then a youth of indescribable beauty rides in on a black steed, and an immense multitude of all nations follow him. The youth represents death, for whom all the peoples are yearning. And finally, in the last scene we are suddenly shown the Tower of Babel, and certain athletes at last finish building it with a song of new hope, and when at length they complete the topmost pinnacle, the Lord of Olympia, let us say, takes flight in a comic fashion, and man, grasping the situation and seizing his place, at once begins a new life with new insight into things. Well, this poem was thought at that time to be dangerous. Last year I proposed to Stepan Trofimovitch to publish it, on the ground of its perfect harmlessness nowadays, but he declined the suggestion with evident dissatisfaction. My view of its complete harmlessness evidently displeased him, and I even ascribed to it a certain coldness on his part, which lasted 2 whole months. And what do you think? Suddenly, almost at the time I proposed printing it here, our poem was published abroad in a collection of revolutionary verse, without the knowledge of Stepan Trofimovitch. He was at first alarmed, rushed to the governor, and wrote a noble letter in self-defense to Petersburg. He read it to me twice, but did not send it, not knowing to whom to address it. In fact, he was in a state of agitation for a whole month, but I am convinced that in the secret recesses of his heart he was enormously flattered. He almost took the copy of the collection to bed with him, and kept it hidden under his mattress in the daytime. He positively would not allow the women to turn his bed, and although he expected every day a telegram, he held his head high. No telegram came. Then he made friends with me again, which is a proof of the extreme kindness of his gentle and unresentful heart. Of course, I don't assert that he had never suffered for his convictions at all, but I am fully convinced that he might have gone on lecturing on his Arabs as long as he liked, if he had only given the necessary explanations. But he was too lofty, and he proceeded with peculiar haste to assure himself that his career was ruined forever by the vortex of circumstance. And if the whole truth is to be told, the real cause of the change in his career was the very delicate proposition which had been made before and was then renewed by Varvara Petrovna Stavrogin, a lady of great wealth, the wife of a lieutenant general, that he should undertake the education and the whole intellectual development of her only son in the capacity of a superior sort of teacher and friend, to say nothing of a magnificent salary. This proposal had been made to him the first time in Berlin at the moment when he was first left a widower. His first wife was a frivolous girl from our province, whom he married in his early and unthinking youth, and apparently he had had a great deal of trouble with this young person, charming as she was, owing to the lack of means for her support, and also from other, more delicate, reasons. She died in Paris after 3 years' separation from him, leaving him a son of 5 years old. The fruit of our first, joyous, and unclouded love, were the words the sorrowing father once let fall in my presence. The child had, from the first, been sent back to Russia, where he was brought up in the charge of distant cousins in some remote region. Stepan Trofimovich had declined Varvara Petrovna's proposal on that occasion and had quickly married again, before the year was over, a taciturn Berlin girl, and, what makes it more strange, there was no particular necessity for him to do so. But apart from his marriage there were, it appears, other reasons for his declining the situation. He was tempted by the resounding fame of a professor, celebrated at that time, and he, in his turn, hastened to the lecturer's chair for which he had been preparing himself, to try his eagle wings in flight. But now with singed wings he naturally remembered the proposition which even then had made him hesitate. The sudden death of his second wife, who did not live a year with him, settled the matter decisively. To put it plainly, it was all brought about by the passionate sympathy and priceless, so to speak, classic friendship of Varvara Petrovna, if one may use such an expression of friendship. He flung himself into the arms of this friendship, and his position was settled for more than 20 years. I use the expression flung himself into the arms of, but God forbid that anyone should fly to idle and superfluous conclusions. These embraces must be understood only in the most loftily moral sense. The most refined and delicate tie united these two beings, both so remarkable, forever. The post of tutor was the more readily accepted too, as the property, a very small one, left to Stepan Trofimovich by his first wife was close to Skvoreshniki, the Stavrogins' magnificent estate on the outskirts of our provincial town. Besides, in the stillness of his study, far from the immense burden of university work, it was always possible to devote himself to the service of science, and to enrich the literature of his country with erudite studies. These works did not appear. But on the other hand, it did appear possible to spend the rest of his life, more than 20 years, a reproach incarnate, so to speak, to his native country, in the words of a popular poet. Reproach incarnate, thou didst stand erect before thy fatherland, O liberal idealist. But the person to whom the popular poet referred may perhaps have had the right to adopt that pose for the rest of his life if he had wished to do so, though it must have been tedious. Our Stepan Trofimovich was, to tell the truth, only an imitator compared with such people. Moreover, he had grown weary of standing erect and often lay down for a while. But, to do him justice, the incarnation of reproach was preserved even in the recumbent attitude, the more so as that was quite sufficient for the province. You should have seen him at our club when he sat down to cards. His whole figure seemed to exclaim, "Cards! Me sit down to whist with you! Is it consistent? Who is responsible for it? Who has shattered my energies and turned them to whist? Ah, perish Russia!" And he would majestically trump with a heart. And to tell the truth, he dearly loved a game of cards, which led him, especially in later years, into frequent and unpleasant skirmishes with Varvara Petrovna, particularly as he was always losing. But of that later. I will only observe that he was a man of tender conscience, that is, sometimes, and so was often depressed. In the course of his 20 years' friendship with Varvara Petrovna he used regularly, 3 or 4 times a year, to sink into a state of patriotic grief, as it was called among us, or rather really into an attack of spleen, but our estimable Varvara Petrovna preferred the former phrase. Of late years his grief had begun to be not only patriotic, but at times alcoholic too, but Varvara Petrovna's alertness succeeded in keeping him all his life from trivial inclinations. And he needed someone to look after him indeed, for he sometimes behaved very oddly. In the midst of his exalted sorrow he would begin laughing like any simple peasant. There were moments when he began to take a humorous tone even about himself. But there was nothing Varvara Petrovna dreaded so much as a humorous tone. She was a woman of the classic type, a female Maecenas, invariably guided only by the highest considerations. The influence of this exalted lady over her poor friend for 20 years is a fact of the first importance. I shall need to speak of her more particularly, which I now proceed to do. There are strange friendships. The two friends are always ready to fly at one another, and go on like that all their lives, and yet they cannot separate. Parting, in fact, is utterly impossible. The one who has begun the quarrel and separated will be the first to fall ill and even die, perhaps, if the separation comes off. I know for a positive fact that several times Stepan Trofimovitch has jumped up from the sofa and beaten the wall with his fists after the most intimate and emotional tête-à-tête with Varvara Petrovna. This proceeding was by no means an empty symbol. Indeed, on one occasion, he broke some plaster off the wall. It may be asked how I come to know such delicate details. What if I were myself a witness of it? What if Stepan Trofimovitch himself has, on more than one occasion, sobbed on my shoulder while he described to me in lurid colors all his most secret feelings? And what was there he did not say at such times? But what almost always happened after these tearful outbreaks was that next day he was ready to crucify himself for his ingratitude. He would send for me in a hurry or run over to see me simply to assure me that Varvara Petrovna was an angel of honor and delicacy, while he was very much the opposite. He did not only run to confide in me, but, on more than one occasion, described it all to her in the most eloquent letter, and wrote a full-signed confession that no longer ago than the day before he had told an outsider that she kept him out of vanity, that she was envious of his talents and erudition, that she hated him and was only afraid to express her hatred openly, dreading that he would leave her and so damage her literary reputation, that this drove him to self-contempt, and he was resolved to die a violent death, and that he was waiting for the final word from her which would decide everything, and so on in the same style. You can fancy after this what an hysterical pitch the nervous outbreaks of this most innocent of all 50-year-old infants sometimes reached. I once read one of these letters after some quarrel between them, arising from a trivial matter, but growing venomous as it went on. I was horrified and besought him not to send it. I must, more honorable, duty. I shall die if I don't confess everything, he answered almost in delirium, and he did send the letter. That was the difference between them, that Varvara Petrovna never would have sent such a letter. It is true that he was passionately fond of writing. He wrote to her though he lived in the same house, and during hysterical interludes he would write 2 letters a day. I know for a fact that she always read these letters with the greatest attention, even when she received 2 a day, and after reading them, she put them away in a special drawer, sorted and annotated. Moreover, she pondered them in her heart. But she kept her friend all day without an answer, met him as though there were nothing the matter, exactly as though nothing special had happened the day before. By degrees she broke him in so completely that at last he did not himself dare to allude to what had happened the day before, and only glanced into her eyes at times. But she never forgot anything, while he sometimes forgot too quickly, and encouraged by her composure he would not infrequently, if friends came in, laugh and make jokes over the champagne the very same day. With what malignancy she must have looked at him at such moments, while he noticed nothing. Perhaps in a week's time, a month's time, or even 6 months later, chancing to recall some phrase in such a letter, and then the whole letter with all its attendant circumstances, he would suddenly grow hot with shame, and be so upset that he fell ill with one of his attacks of summer cholera. These attacks of a sort of summer cholera were, in some cases, the regular consequence of his nervous agitations and were an interesting peculiarity of his physical constitution. No doubt Varvara Petrovna did very often hate him. But there was one thing he had not discerned up to the end, that was that he had become for her a son, her creation, even, one may say, her invention. He had become flesh of her flesh, and she kept and supported him not simply from envy of his talents And how wounded she must have been by such suppositions. An inexhaustible love for him lay concealed in her heart in the midst of continual hatred, jealousy, and contempt. She would not let a speck of dust fall upon him, coddled him up for 22 years, would not have slept for nights together if there were the faintest breath against his reputation as a poet, a learned man, and a public character. She had invented him, and had been the first to believe in her own invention. He was, after a fashion, her daydream. But in return she exacted a great deal from him, sometimes even slavishness. It was incredible how long she harbored resentment. I have 2 anecdotes to tell about that. On one occasion, just at the time when the first rumors of the emancipation of the serfs were in the air, when all Russia was exulting and making ready for a complete regeneration, Varvara Petrovna was visited by a baron from Petersburg, a man of the highest connections, and very closely associated with the new reform. Varvara Petrovna prized such visits highly, as her connections in higher circles had grown weaker and weaker since the death of her husband, and had at last ceased altogether. The baron spent an hour drinking tea with her. There was no one else present but Stepan Trofimovich, whom Varvara Petrovna invited and exhibited. The baron had heard something about him before or affected to have done so, but paid little attention to him at tea. Stepan Trofimovich, of course, was incapable of making a social blunder, and his manners were most elegant. Though I believe he was by no means of exalted origin, yet it happened that he had from earliest childhood been brought up in a Moscow household, of high rank, and consequently was well bred. He spoke French like a Parisian. Thus the baron was to have seen from the first glance the sort of people with whom Varvara Petrovna surrounded herself, even in provincial seclusion. But things did not fall out like this. When the baron positively asserted the absolute truth of the rumors of the great reform, which were then only just beginning to be heard, Stepan Trofimovich could not contain himself, and suddenly shouted hurrah, and even made some gesticulation indicative of delight. His ejaculation was not over loud and quite polite, his delight was even perhaps premeditated, and his gesture purposely studied before the looking-glass half an hour before tea. But something must have been amiss with it, for the baron permitted himself a faint smile, though he, at once, with extraordinary courtesy, put in a phrase concerning the universal and befitting emotion of all Russian hearts in view of the great event. Shortly afterwards he took his leave and at parting did not forget to hold out 2 fingers to Stepan Trofimovich. On returning to the drawing-room Varvara Petrovna was at first silent for 2 or 3 minutes, and seemed to be looking for something on the table. Then she turned to Stepan Trofimovich, and with pale face and flashing eyes she hissed in a whisper, "I shall never forgive you for that." Next day she met her friend as though nothing had happened. She never referred to the incident, but 13 years afterwards, at a tragic moment, she recalled it and reproached him with it, and she turned pale, just as she had done 13 years before. Only twice in the course of her life did she say to him, "I shall never forgive you for that." The incident with the baron was the second time, but the first incident was so characteristic and had so much influence on the fate of Stepan Trofimovich that I venture to refer to that too. It was in 1855, in springtime, in May, just after the news had reached Skvoreshniki of the death of Lieutenant General Stavrogin, a frivolous old gentleman who died of a stomach ailment on the way to the Crimea, where he was hastening to join the army on active service. Varvara Petrovna was left a widow and put on deep mourning. She could not, it is true, deplore his death very deeply, since, for the last 4 years, she had been completely separated from him owing to incompatibility of temper, and was giving him an allowance. The lieutenant general himself had nothing but 150 serfs and his pay, besides his position and his connections. All the money and Skvoreshniki belonged to Varvara Petrovna, the only daughter of a very rich contractor. Yet she was shocked by the suddenness of the news, and retired into complete solitude. Stepan Trofimovich, of course, was always at her side. May was in its full beauty. The evenings were exquisite. The wild cherry was in flower. The 2 friends walked every evening in the garden and used to sit till nightfall in the arbor, and pour out their thoughts and feelings to one another. They had poetic moments. Under the influence of the change in her position, Varvara Petrovna talked more than usual. She, as it were, clung to the heart of her friend, and this continued for several evenings. A strange idea suddenly came over Stepan Trofimovich. Was not the inconsolable widow reckoning upon him and expecting from him, when her mourning was over, the offer of his hand? A cynical idea, but the very loftiness of a man's nature sometimes increases a disposition to cynical ideas if only from the many-sidedness of his culture. He began to look more deeply into it, and thought it seemed like it. He pondered, her fortune is immense, of course, but Varvara Petrovna certainly could not be called a beauty. She was a tall, yellow, bony woman with an extremely long face, suggestive of a horse. Stepan Trofimovich hesitated more and more, he was tortured by doubts, he positively shed tears of indecision once or twice, he wept not infrequently. In the evenings, that is to say in the arbor, his countenance involuntarily began to express something capricious and ironical, something coquettish and at the same time condescending. This is apt to happen as it were by accident, and the more gentlemanly the man the more noticeable it is. Goodness only knows what one is to think about it, but it's most likely that nothing had begun working in her heart that could have fully justified Stepan Trofimovich's suspicions. Moreover, she would not have changed her name, Stavrogin, for his name, famous as it was. Perhaps there was nothing in it but the play of femininity on her side, the manifestation of an unconscious feminine yearning so natural in some extremely feminine types. However, I won't answer for it, the depths of the female heart have not been explored to this day. But I must continue. It is to be supposed that she soon inwardly guessed the significance of her friend's strange expression. She was quick and observant, and he was sometimes extremely guileless. But the evenings went on as before, and their conversations were just as poetic and interesting. And behold, on one occasion at nightfall, after the most lively and poetical conversation, they parted affectionately, warmly pressing each other's hands at the steps of the lodge where Stepan Trofimovich slept. Every summer he used to move into this little lodge, which stood adjoining the huge seigneurial house of Sporishniki, almost in the garden. He had only just gone in, and in restless hesitation taken a cigar, and not having yet lighted it, was standing weary and motionless, before the open window, gazing at the light feathery white clouds gliding around the bright moon, when suddenly a faint rustle made him start and turn round. Varvara Petrovna, whom he had left only 4 minutes earlier, was standing before him again. Her yellow face was almost blue. Her lips were pressed tightly together and twitching at the corners. For 10 full seconds she looked him in the eyes in silence with a firm relentless gaze, and suddenly whispered rapidly, "I shall never forgive you for this." When, 10 years later, Stepan Trofimovich, after closing the doors, told me this melancholy tale in a whisper, he vowed that he had been so petrified on the spot that he had not seen or heard how Varvara Petrovna had disappeared. As she never once afterwards alluded to the incident and everything went on as though nothing had happened, he was all his life inclined to the idea that it was all an hallucination, a symptom of illness, the more so as he was actually taken ill that very night and was indisposed for a fortnight, which, by the way, cut short the interviews in the arbor. But in spite of his vague theory of hallucination he seemed every day, all his life, to be expecting the continuation, and, so to say, the denouement of this affair. He could not believe that that was the end of it. And if so, he must have looked strangely sometimes at his friend. She had herself designed the costume for him which he wore for the rest of his life. It was elegant and characteristic, a long black frock coat, buttoned almost to the top, but stylishly cut, a soft hat, in summer a straw hat, with a wide brim, a white batiste cravat with a full bow and hanging ends, a cane with a silver knob, his hair flowed onto his shoulders. It was dark brown, and only lately had begun to get a little gray. He was clean-shaven. He was said to have been very handsome in his youth. And, to my mind, he was still an exceptionally impressive figure even in old age. Besides, who can talk of old age at 53? From his special pose as a patriot, however, he did not try to appear younger, but seemed rather to pride himself on the solidity of his age, and, dressed as described, tall and thin with flowing hair, he looked almost like a patriarch, or even more like the portrait of the poet Kukelnik, engraved in the edition of his works published in 1830 or thereabouts. This resemblance was especially striking when he sat in the garden in summertime, on a seat under a bush of flowering lilac, with both hands propped on his cane and an open book beside him, musing poetically over the setting sun. In regard to books, I may remark that he came in later years rather to avoid reading. But that was only quite towards the end. the papers and magazines ordered in great profusion by Varvara Petrovna he was continually reading. He never lost interest in the successes of Russian literature either, though he always maintained a dignified attitude with regard to them. He was at one time engrossed in the study of our home and foreign politics, but he soon gave up the undertaking with a gesture of despair. It sometimes happened that he would take de Tocqueville with him into the garden while he had a Paul de Kock in his pocket. But these are trivial matters. I must observe in parenthesis about the portrait of Kukulnik. The engraving had first come into the hands of Varvara Petrovna when she was a girl in a high-class boarding school in Moscow. She fell in love with the portrait at once, after the habit of all girls at school who fall in love with anything they come across, as well as with their teachers, especially the drawing and writing masters. What is interesting in this, though, is not the characteristics of girls, but the fact that even at 50 Varvara Petrovna kept the engraving among her most intimate and treasured possessions, so that perhaps it was only on this account that she had designed for Stepan Trofimovich a costume somewhat like the poet's in the engraving. But that, of course, is a trifling matter too. For the first years or, more accurately, for the first half of the time he spent with Varvara Petrovna, Stepan Trofimovich was still planning a book and every day seriously prepared to write it. But during the later period he must have forgotten even what he had done. More and more frequently he used to say to us, "I seem to be ready for work, my materials are collected, yet the work doesn't get done. Nothing is done." And he would bow his head dejectedly. No doubt this was calculated to increase his prestige in our eyes as a martyr to science, but he himself was longing for something else. "They have forgotten me. I'm no use to anyone," broke from him more than once. This intensified depression took special hold of him towards the end of the 50s. Varvara Petrovna realized at last that it was a serious matter. Besides, she could not endure the idea that her friend was forgotten and useless. To distract him and at the same time to renew his fame she carried him off to Moscow, where she had fashionable acquaintances in the literary and scientific world, but it appeared that Moscow too was unsatisfactory. It was a peculiar time, something new was beginning, quite unlike the stagnation of the past, something very strange too, though it was felt everywhere, even at Skvoreshniki. Rumors of all sorts reached us. The facts were generally more or less well known, but it was evident that in addition to the facts there were certain ideas accompanying them, and what's more, a great number of them. And this was perplexing. It was impossible to estimate and find out exactly what was the drift of these ideas. Varvara Petrovna was prompted by the feminine composition of her character to a compelling desire to penetrate the secret of them. She took to reading newspapers and magazines, prohibited publications printed abroad, and even the revolutionary manifestos, which were just beginning to appear at the time. She was able to procure them all, but this only set her head in a whirl. She fell to writing letters, she got few answers, and they grew more incomprehensible as time went on. Stepan Trofimovich was solemnly called upon to explain these ideas to her once for all, but she remained distinctly dissatisfied with his explanations. Stepan Trofimovich's view of the general movement was supercilious in the extreme. In his eyes all it amounted to was that he was forgotten and of no use. At last his name was mentioned, at first in periodicals published abroad as that of an exiled martyr, and immediately afterwards in Petersburg as that of a former star in a celebrated constellation. He was even for some reason compared with Radishchev. Then someone printed the statement that he was dead and promised an obituary notice of him. Stepan Trofimovich instantly perked up and assumed an air of immense dignity. All his disdain for his contemporaries evaporated, and he began to cherish the dream of joining the movement and showing his powers. Varvara Petrovna's faith in everything instantly revived, and she was thrown into a violent ferment. It was decided to go to Petersburg without a moment's delay, to find out everything on the spot, to go into everything personally, and, if possible, to throw themselves heart and soul into the new movement. Among other things she announced that she was prepared to found a magazine of her own, and henceforward to devote her whole life to it. Seeing what it had come to, Stepan Trofimovich became more condescending than ever, and on the journey began to behave almost patronizingly to Varvara Petrovna, which she at once laid up in her heart against him. She had, however, another very important reason for the trip, which was to renew her connections in higher spheres. It was necessary, as far as she could, to remind the world of her existence, or at any rate to make an attempt to do so. The ostensible object of the journey was to see her only son, who was just finishing his studies at a Petersburg lyceum. They spent almost the whole winter season in Petersburg. But by Lent everything burst like a rainbow-colored soap bubble. Their dreams were dissipated, and the muddle, far from being cleared up, had become even more revoltingly incomprehensible. To begin with, connections with the higher spheres were not established, or only on a microscopic scale, and by humiliating exertions. In her mortification, Varvara Petrovna threw herself heart and soul into the new ideas, and began giving evening receptions. She invited literary people, and they were brought to her at once in multitudes. Afterwards they came of themselves without invitation, one brought another. Never had she seen such literary men. They were incredibly vain, but quite open in their vanity, as though they were performing a duty by the display of it. Some, but by no means all, of them even turned up intoxicated, seeming, however, to detect in this a peculiar, only recently discovered, merit. They were all strangely proud of something. On every face was written that they had only just discovered some extremely important secret. They abused one another, and took credit to themselves for it. It was rather difficult to find out what they had written exactly, but among them there were critics, novelists, dramatists, satirists, and exposers of abuses. Stepan Trofimovich penetrated into their very highest circle from which the movement was directed. Incredible heights had to be scaled to reach this group, but they gave him a cordial welcome, though, of course, no one of them had ever heard of him or knew anything about him except that he represented an idea. His maneuvers among them were so successful that he got them twice to Varvara Petrovna's salon in spite of their Olympian grandeur. These people were very serious and very polite, they behaved nicely, the others were evidently afraid of them, but it was obvious that they had no time to spare. 2 or 3 former literary celebrities who happened to be in Petersburg, and with whom Varvara Petrovna had long maintained a most refined correspondence, came also. But to her surprise these genuine and quite indubitable celebrities were stiller than water, humbler than the grass, and some of them simply hung onto this new rabble, and were shamefully cringing before them. At first Stepan Trofimovich was a success. People caught at him and began to exhibit him at public literary gatherings. The first time he came onto the platform at some public reading in which he was to take part, he was received with enthusiastic clapping which lasted for 5 minutes. He recalled this with tears 9 years afterwards, though rather from his natural artistic sensibility than from gratitude. "I swear, and I'm ready to bet," he declared, but only to me, and in secret, that not one of that audience knew anything whatever about me. A noteworthy admission. He must have had a keen intelligence since he was capable of grasping his position so clearly even on the platform, even in such a state of exaltation. It also follows that he had not a keen intelligence if, 9 years afterwards, he could not recall it without mortification. He was made to sign 2 or 3 collective protests, against what he did not know, he signed them. Varvara Petrovna too was made to protest against some disgraceful action and she signed too. The majority of these new people, however, though they visited Varvara Petrovna, felt themselves for some reason called upon to regard her with contempt, and with undisguised irony. Stepan Trofimovich hinted to me at bitter moments afterwards that it was from that time she had been envious of him. She saw, of course, that she could not get on with these people, yet she received them eagerly, with all the hysterical impatience of her sex, and, what is more, she expected something. At her parties she talked little, although she could talk, but she listened the more. They talked of the abolition of the censorship, and of phonetic spelling, of the substitution of the Latin characters for the Russian alphabet, of someone's having been sent into exile the day before, of some scandal, of the advantage of splitting Russia into nationalities united in a free federation, of the abolition of the army and the navy, of the restoration of Poland as far as the Dnieper, of the peasant reforms, and of the manifestos, of the abolition of the hereditary principle, of the family, of children, and of priests, of women's rights, of Krevsky's house, for which no one ever seemed able to forgive Mr. Krevsky, and so on, and so on. It was evident that in this mob of new people there were many impostors, but undoubtedly there were also many honest and very attractive people, in spite of some surprising characteristics in them. The honest ones were far more difficult to understand than the coarse and dishonest, but it was impossible to tell which was being made a tool of by the other. When Varvara Petrovna announced her idea of founding a magazine, people flocked to her in even larger numbers, but charges of being a capitalist and an exploiter of labor were showered upon her to her face. The rudeness of these accusations was only equaled by their unexpectedness. The aged General Ivan Ivanovich Drozdov, an old friend and comrade of the late General Stavrogin's, known to us all here as an extremely stubborn and irritable, though very estimable, man, in his own way, of course, who ate a great deal, and was dreadfully afraid of atheism, quarreled at one of Varvara Petrovna's parties with a distinguished young man. The latter at the first word exclaimed, "You must be a general if you talk like that," meaning that he could find no word of abuse worse than general. Ivan Ivanovich flew into a terrible passion. "Yes, sir, I am a general, and a lieutenant general, and I have served my Tsar, and you, sir, are a puppy and an infidel." An outrageous scene followed. Next day the incident was exposed in print, and they began getting up a collective protest against Varvara Petrovna's disgraceful conduct in not having immediately turned the general out. In an illustrated paper there appeared a malignant caricature in which Varvara Petrovna, Stepan Trofimovich, and General Drozdov were depicted as three reactionary friends. There were verses attached to this caricature written by a popular poet especially for the occasion. I may observe, for my own part, that many persons of general's rank certainly have an absurd habit of saying, "I have served my Tsar," just as though they had not the same Tsar as all the rest of us, their simple fellow subjects, but had a special Tsar of their own. It was impossible, of course, to remain any longer in Petersburg, all the more so as Stepan Trofimovich was overtaken by a complete fiasco. He could not resist talking of the claims of art, and they laughed at him more loudly as time went on. At his last lecture he thought to impress them with patriotic eloquence, hoping to touch their hearts, and reckoning on the respect inspired by his persecution. He did not attempt to dispute the uselessness and absurdity of the word fatherland, acknowledge the pernicious influence of religion, but firmly and loudly declared that boots were of less consequence than Pushkin, of much less, indeed. He was hissed so mercilessly that he burst into tears, there and then, on the platform. Varvara Petrovna took him home more dead than alive. On ma trait comme un vieux bonnet de coton, he babbled senselessly. She was looking after him all night, giving him laurel drops and repeating to him till daybreak, "You will still be of use, you will still make your mark, you will be appreciated, in another place." Early next morning 5 literary men called on Varvara Petrovna, 3 of them complete strangers, whom she had never set eyes on before. With a stern air they informed her that they had looked into the question of her magazine, and had brought her their decision on the subject. Varvara Petrovna had never authorized anyone to look into or decide anything concerning her magazine. Their decision was that, having founded the magazine, she should at once hand it over to them with the capital to run it, on the basis of a cooperative society. She herself was to go back to Skvoreshniki, not forgetting to take with her Stepan Trofimovich, who was out of date. From delicacy they agreed to recognize the right of property in her case, and to send her every year a 1/6 part of the net profits. What was most touching about it was that of these 5 men, for certainly were not actuated by any mercenary motive, and were simply acting in the interests of the cause. "We came away utterly at a loss," Stepan Trofimovich used to say afterwards. "I couldn't make head or tail of it, and kept muttering, I remember, to the rumble of the train. Vyek and Vyek and Lyev Kambek. Lyev Kambek and Vyek and Vyek. And goodness knows what, all the way to Moscow. It was only in Moscow that I came to myself, as though we really might find something different there. Oh, my friends," he would exclaim to us sometimes with fervor, "you cannot imagine what wrath and sadness overcome your whole soul when a great idea, which you have long cherished as holy, is caught up by the ignorant and dragged forth before fools like themselves into the street, and you suddenly meet it in the market unrecognizable, in the mud, absurdly set up, without proportion, without harmony, the plaything of foolish louts. No! In our day it was not so, and it was not this for which we strove. No, no, not this at all. I don't recognize it. Our day will come again and will turn all the tottering fabric of today into a true path. If not, what will happen?" Immediately on their return from Petersburg Varvara Petrovna sent her friend abroad to recruit, and, indeed, it was necessary for them to part for a time, she felt that. Stepan Trofimovich was delighted to go. "There I shall revive," he exclaimed. "There, at last, I shall set to work." But in the first of his letters from Berlin he struck his usual note. "My heart is broken," he wrote to Varvara Petrovna. "I can forget nothing. Here, in Berlin, everything brings back to me my old past, my first raptures and my first agonies. Where is she? Where are they both? Where are you two angels of whom I was never worthy? Where's my son, my beloved son? And last of all, where am I, where is my old self, strong as steel, firm as a rock, when now some Andreyev, our orthodox clown with a beard, put Breezer on existence and do, and so on." As for Stepan Trofimovich's son, he had only seen him twice in his life, the first time when he was born and the second time lately in Petersburg, where the young man was preparing to enter the university. The boy had been all his life, as we have said already, brought up by his aunts, at Varvara Petrovna's expense, in a remote province, nearly 600 miles from Skvoreshniki. As for Andreyev, he was nothing more or less than our local shopkeeper, a very eccentric fellow, a self-taught archaeologist who had a passion for collecting Russian antiquities and sometimes tried to outshine Stepan Trofimovich in erudition and in the progressiveness of his opinions. This worthy shopkeeper, with a grey beard and silver-rimmed spectacles, still owed Stepan Trofimovich 400 rubles for some acres of timber he had bought on the latter's little estate, near Skvoreshniki. Though Varvara Petrovna had liberally provided her friend with funds when she sent him to Berlin, yet Stepan Trofimovich had, before starting, particularly reckoned on getting that 400 rubles, probably for his secret expenditure, and was ready to cry when Andreyev asked leave to defer payment for a month, which he had a right to do, since he had brought the first installments of the money almost 6 months in advance to meet Stepan Trofimovich's special need at the time. Varvara Petrovna read this first letter greedily, and underlining in pencil the exclamation, "Where are they both?" numbered it and put it away in a drawer. He had, of course, referred to his two deceased wives. The second letter she received from Berlin was in a different strain. "I am working 12 hours out of the 24. 11 would be enough," muttered Varvara Petrovna. "I'm rummaging in the libraries, collating, copying, rushing about. I've visited the professors. I have renewed my acquaintance with the delightful Dundasov family. What a charming creature Elizaveta Nikolaevna is even now. She sends you her greetings. Her young husband and 3 nephews are all in Berlin. I sit up talking till daybreak with the young people, and we have almost Athenian evenings, Athenian, I mean, only in their intellectual subtlety and refinement. Everything is in noble style, a great deal of music, Spanish airs, dreams of the regeneration of all humanity, ideas of eternal beauty, of the Sistine Madonna, light interspersed with darkness, but there are spots even on the sun. Oh, my friend, my noble, faithful friend! In heart I am with you and am yours, with you alone, always, and tau pays, even in le pays de Makar et de ses vo, of which we often used to talk in agitation in Petersburg, do you remember, before we came away? I think of it with a smile. Crossing the frontier, I felt myself in safety, a sensation, strange and new, for the first time after so many years, and so on and so on. Come, it's all nonsense," Varvara Petrovna commented, folding up that letter too. "If he's up till daybreak with his Athenian nights, he isn't at his books for 12 hours a day. Was he drunk when he wrote it? That Dundasov woman dares to send me greetings. But there, let him amuse himself." The phrase "Don le pays de Makar et de ses vo" meant, wherever Makar may drive his calves. Stepan Trofimovich sometimes purposely translated Russian proverbs and traditional sayings into French in the most stupid way, though no doubt he was able to understand and translate them better. But he did it from a feeling that it was chic, and thought it witty. But he did not amuse himself for long. He could not hold out for 4 months, and was soon flying back to Skvoreshniki. His last letters consisted of nothing but outpourings of the most sentimental love for his absent friend, and were literally wet with tears. There are natures extremely attached to home like lapdogs. The meeting of the friends was enthusiastic. Within 2 days everything was as before and even duller than before. My friend, Stepan Trofimovich, said to me a fortnight after, in dead secret, I have discovered something awful for me, something new, je suis un simple dependent, et rien de plus. Mais rien de plus. After this, we had a period of stagnation which lasted 9 years. The hysterical outbreaks and sobbings on my shoulder that recurred at regular intervals did not in the least mar our prosperity. I wonder that Stepan Trofimovich did not grow stout during this period. His nose was a little redder, and his manner had gained in urbanity, that was all. By degrees a circle of friends had formed around him, although it was never a very large one. Though Varvara Petrovna had little to do with the circle, yet we all recognized her as our patroness. After the lesson she had received in Petersburg, she settled down in our town for good. In winter she lived in her townhouse and spent the summer on her estate in the neighborhood. She had never enjoyed so much consequence and prestige in our provincial society as during the last 7 years of this period, that is up to the time of the appointment of our present governor. Our former governor, the mild Ivan Osipovich, who will never be forgotten among us, was a near relation of Varvara Petrovna's, and had at one time been under obligations to her. His wife trembled at the very thought of displeasing her, while the homage paid her by provincial society was carried almost to a pitch that suggested idolatry. So Stepan Trofimovich, too, had a good time. He was a member of the club, lost at cards majestically, and was everywhere treated with respect, though many people regarded him only as a learned man. Later on, when Varvara Petrovna allowed him to live in a separate house, we enjoyed greater freedom than before. Twice a week we used to meet at his house. We were a merry party, especially when he was not sparing of the champagne. The wine came from the shop of the same Andreyev. The bill was paid twice a year by Varvara Petrovna, and on the day it was paid Stepan Trofimovich almost invariably suffered from an attack of his summer cholera. One of the first members of our circle was Liputin, an elderly provincial official, and a great liberal, who was reputed in the town to be an atheist. He had married for the second time a young and pretty wife with a dowry, and had, besides, 3 grown-up daughters. He brought up his family in the fear of God, and kept a tight hand over them. He was extremely stingy, and out of his salary had bought himself a house and amassed a fortune. He was an uncomfortable sort of man, and had not been in the service. He was not much respected in the town, and was not received in the best circles. Moreover, he was a scandalmonger, and had more than once had to smart for his backbiting, for which he had been badly punished by an officer, and again by a country gentleman, the respectable head of a family. But we liked his wit, his inquiring mind, his peculiar, malicious liveliness. Varvara Petrovna disliked him, but he always knew how to make up to her. Nor did she care for Shadov, who became one of our circle during the last years of this period. Shadov had been a student and had been expelled from the university after some disturbance. In his childhood he had been a student of Stepan Trofimovich's and was by birth a serf of Varvara Petrovna's, the son of a former valet of hers, Pavel Fyodorich, and was greatly indebted to her bounty. She disliked him for his pride and ingratitude and could never forgive him for not having come straight to her on his expulsion from the university. On the contrary, he had not even answered the letter she had expressly sent him at the time, and preferred to be a drudge in the family of a merchant of the new style, with whom he went abroad, looking after his children more in the position of a nurse than of a tutor. He was very eager to travel at the time. The children had a governess too, a lively young Russian lady, who also became one of the household on the eve of their departure, and had been engaged chiefly because she was so cheap. 2 months later, the merchant turned her out of the house for free thinking. Shadov took himself off after her and soon afterwards married her in Geneva. They lived together about 3 weeks, and then parted as free people recognizing no bonds, though, no doubt, also through poverty. He wandered about Europe alone for a long time afterwards, living God knows how. He is said to have blacked boots in the street, and to have been a porter in some dockyard. At last, a year before, he had returned to his native place among us and settled with an old aunt, whom he buried a month later. His sister Dasha, who had also been brought up by Varvara Petrovna, was a favorite of hers, and treated with respect and consideration in her house. He saw his sister rarely and was not on intimate terms with her. In our circle, he was always sullen and never talkative, but from time to time, when his convictions were touched upon, he became morbidly irritable and very unrestrained in his language. One has to tie Shadov up and then argue with him, Stepan Trofimovich would sometimes say in joke, but he liked him. Shadov had radically changed some of his former socialistic convictions abroad and had rushed to the opposite extreme. He was one of those idealistic beings common in Russia, who are suddenly struck by some overmastering idea which seems, as it were, to crush them at once, and sometimes forever. They are never equal to coping with it, but put passionate faith in it, and their whole life passes afterwards, as it were, in the last agonies under the weight of the stone that has fallen upon them and half crushed them. In appearance Shadov was in complete harmony with his convictions. He was short, awkward, had a shock of flaxen hair, broad shoulders, thick lips, very thick overhanging white eyebrows, a wrinkled forehead, and a hostile, obstinately downcast, as it were shamefaced, expression in his eyes. His hair was always in a wild tangle and stood up in a shock which nothing could smooth. He was 7 or 8 and 20. I no longer wonder that his wife ran away from him, Varvara Petrovna enunciated on one occasion after gazing intently at him. He tried to be neat in his dress, in spite of his extreme poverty. He refrained again from appealing to Varvara Petrovna, and struggled along as best he could, doing various jobs for tradespeople. At one time he served in a shop, at another he was on the point of going as an assistant clerk on a freight steamer, but he fell ill just at the time of sailing. It is hard to imagine what poverty he was capable of enduring without thinking about it at all. After his illness, Varvara Petrovna sent him 100 rubles, anonymously and in secret. He found out the secret, however, and after some reflection took the money and went to Varvara Petrovna to thank her. She received him with warmth, but on this occasion, too, he shamefully disappointed her. He only stayed 5 minutes, staring blankly at the ground and smiling stupidly in profound silence, and suddenly, at the most interesting point, without listening to what she was saying, he got up, made an uncouth sideways bow, helpless with confusion, caught against the lady's expensive inlaid worktable, upsetting it on the floor and smashing it to atoms, and walked out nearly dead with shame. Liputin blamed him severely afterwards for having accepted the 100 rubles and having even gone to thank Varvara Petrovna for them, instead of having returned the money with contempt, because it had come from his former despotic mistress. He lived in solitude on the outskirts of the town, and did not like any of us to go and see him. He used to turn up invariably at Stepan Trofimovich's evenings, and borrowed newspapers and books from him. There was another young man who always came, one Virginsky, a clerk in the service here, who had something in common with Shadov, though on the surface he seemed his complete opposite in every respect. He was a family man too. He was a pathetic and very quiet young man, though he was 30. He had considerable education, though he was chiefly self-taught. He was poor, married, and in the service, and supported the aunt and sister of his wife. His wife and all the ladies of his family professed the very latest convictions, but in rather a crude form. It was a case of an idea dragged forth into the street, as Stepan Trofimovich had expressed it upon a former occasion. They got it all out of books, and at the first hint coming from any of our little progressive corners in Petersburg they were prepared to throw anything overboard, so soon as they were advised to do so. Madame Virginsky practiced as a midwife in the town. She had lived a long while in Petersburg as a girl. Virginsky himself was a man of rare single-heartedness, and I have seldom met more honest fervor. I will never, never, abandon these bright hopes, he used to say to me with shining eyes. Of these bright hopes he always spoke quietly, in a blissful half-whisper, as it were secretly. He was rather tall, but extremely thin and narrow-shouldered, and had extraordinarily lank hair of a reddish hue. All Stepan Trofimovich's condescending jibes at some of his opinions he accepted mildly, answered him sometimes very seriously, and often nonplussed him. Stepan Trofimovich treated him very kindly, and indeed he behaved like a father to all of us. You are all half-hearted chickens, he observed to Virginsky in joke. All who are like you, though in you, Virginsky, I have not observed that narrow-mindedness I found in Petersburg, chez ces seminarists. But you're a half-hatched chicken all the same. Shadov would give anything to hatch out, but he's half-hatched too. And I? Liputin inquired. You're simply the golden mean which will get on anywhere in its own way. Liputin was offended. The story was told of Virginsky, and it was unhappily only too true, that before his wife had spent a year in lawful wedlock with him she announced that he was superseded and that she preferred Lebyadkin. This Lebyadkin, a stranger to the town, turned out afterwards to be a very dubious character, and not a retired captain as he represented himself to be. He could do nothing but twist his mustache, drink, and chatter the most inept nonsense that can possibly be imagined. This fellow, who was utterly lacking in delicacy, at once settled in his house, glad to live at another man's expense, ate and slept there and came, in the end, to treating the master of the house with condescension. It was asserted that when Virginsky's wife had announced to him that he was superseded he said to her, "My dear, hitherto I have only loved you, but now I respect you, but I doubt whether this renunciation, worthy of ancient Rome, was ever really uttered." On the contrary, they say that he wept violently. A fortnight after he was superseded, all of them, in a family party, went one day for a picnic to a wood outside the town to drink tea with their friends. Virginsky was in a feverishly lively mood and took part in the dances. But suddenly, without any preliminary quarrel, he seized the giant Lebyadkin with both hands, by the hair, just as the latter was dancing a can-can solo, pushed him down, and began dragging him along with shrieks, shouts, and tears. The giant was so panic-stricken that he did not attempt to defend himself, and hardly uttered a sound all the time he was being dragged along. But afterwards he resented it with all the heat of an honorable man. Virginsky spent a whole night on his knees begging his wife's forgiveness. But this forgiveness was not granted, as he refused to apologize to Lebyadkin. Moreover, he was upbraided for the meanness of his ideas and his foolishness, the latter charge based on the fact that he knelt down in the interview with his wife. The captain soon disappeared and did not reappear in our town till quite lately, when he came with his sister, and with entirely different aims, but of him later. It was no wonder that the poor young husband sought our society and found comfort in it. But he never spoke of his home life to us. On one occasion only, returning with me from Stepan Trofimovitch's, he made a remote allusion to his position, but clutching my hand at once he cried ardently, "It's of no consequence. It's only a personal incident. It's no hindrance to the cause, not the slightest." Stray guests visited our circle too, a Jew, called Lyamshin, and a Captain Kartusov came. An old gentleman of inquiring mind used to come at one time, but he died. Liputin brought an exiled Polish priest called Slontsevsky, and for a time we received him on principle, but afterwards we didn't keep it up. At one time it was reported about the town that our little circle was a hotbed of nihilism, profligacy, and godlessness, and the rumor gained more and more strength. And yet we did nothing but indulge in the most harmless, agreeable, typically Russian, light-hearted liberal chatter. The higher liberalism and the higher liberal, that is, a liberal without any definite aim, is only possible in Russia. Stepan Trofimovitch, like every witty man, needed a listener, and, besides that, he needed the consciousness that he was fulfilling the lofty duty of disseminating ideas. And finally he had to have someone to drink champagne with, and over the wine to exchange light-hearted views of a certain sort, about Russia and the Russian spirit, about God in general, and the Russian God in particular, to repeat for the 100th time the same Russian scandalous stories that everyone knew and everyone repeated. We had no distaste for the gossip of the town which often, indeed, led us to the most severe and loftily moral verdicts. We fell into generalizing about humanity, made stern reflections on the future of Europe and mankind in general, authoritatively predicted that after Caesarism France would at once sink into the position of a second-rate power, and were firmly convinced that this might terribly easily and quickly come to pass. We had long ago predicted that the Pope would play the part of a simple archbishop in a united Italy, and were firmly convinced that this 1,000-year-old question had, in our age of humanitarianism, industry, and railways, become a trifling matter. But, of course, Russian higher liberalism could not look at the question in any other way. Stepan Trofimovitch sometimes talked of art, and very well, though rather abstractly. He sometimes spoke of the friends of his youth, all names noteworthy in the history of Russian progress. He talked of them with emotion and reverence, though sometimes with envy. If we were very much bored, the Jew, Lyamshin, a little post office clerk, a wonderful performer on the piano, sat down to play, and in the intervals would imitate a pig, a thunderstorm, a confinement with the first cry of the baby, and so on, and so on. It was only for this that he was invited, indeed. If we had drunk a great deal, and that did happen sometimes, though not often, we flew into raptures, and even on one occasion sang the Marseillaise in chorus to the accompaniment of Lyamshin, though I don't know how it went off. The great day, the 19th of February, we welcomed enthusiastically, and for a long time beforehand drank toasts in its honor. But that was long ago, before the advent of Shadov or Virgin Sky, when Stepan Trofimovich was still living in the same house with Varvara Petrovna. For some time before the great day, Stepan Trofimovich fell into the habit of muttering to himself well-known, though rather far-fetched, lines which must have been written by some liberal landowner of the past. The peasant with his axe is coming, something terrible will happen. Something of that sort, I don't remember the exact words. Varvara Petrovna overheard him on one occasion, and crying, "Nonsense, nonsense," she went out of the room in a rage. Liputin, who happened to be present, observed malignantly to Stepan Trofimovich, "It'll be a pity if their former serfs really do some mischief to Messrs. less landowners to celebrate the occasion," and he drew his forefinger round his throat. "Cher ami," Stepan Trofimovich observed, "believe me that this," he repeated the gesture, "will never be of any use to our landowners, nor to any of us in general. We shall never be capable of organizing anything even without our heads, though our heads hinder our understanding more than anything. I may observe that many people among us anticipated that something extraordinary, such as Liputin predicted, would take place on the day of the emancipation, and those who held this view were the so-called authorities on the peasantry and the government. I believe Stepan Trofimovich shared this idea, so much so that almost on the eve of the great day he began asking Varvara Petrovna's leave to go abroad. In fact, he began to be uneasy. But the great day passed, and some time passed after it, and the condescending smile reappeared on Stepan Trofimovich's lips. In our presence, he delivered himself of some noteworthy thoughts on the character of the Russian in general, and the Russian peasant in particular. "Like hasty people, we have been in too great a hurry with our peasants," he said in conclusion of a series of remarkable utterances. "We have made them the fashion, and a whole section of writers have for several years treated them as though they were newly discovered curiosities. We have put laurel wreaths on lousy heads. The Russian village has given us only Kamarinsky in 1,000 years. A remarkable Russian poet, who was also something of a wit, seeing the great Rachel on the stage for the first time, cried in ecstasy, 'I wouldn't exchange Rachel for a peasant. I am prepared to go further. I would give all the peasants in Russia for one Rachel. It's high time to look things in the face more soberly, and not to mix up our national rustic pitch with bouquet de l'Impératrice.' Liputin agreed at once, but remarked that one had to perjure oneself and praise the peasant all the same for the sake of being progressive, that even ladies in good society shed tears reading Poor Anton, and that some of them even wrote from Paris to their bailiffs that they were, henceforward, to treat the peasants as humanely as possible. It happened, and as ill luck would have it just after the rumors of the Anton Petrov affair had reached us, that there was some disturbance in our province too, only about 10 miles from Skvoreshniki, so that a detachment of soldiers was sent down in a hurry. This time Stepan Trofimovich was so much upset that he even frightened us. He cried out at the club that more troops were needed, that they ought to be telegraphed for from another province. He rushed off to the governor to protest that he had no hand in it, begged him not to allow his name on account of old associations to be brought into it, and offered to write about his protest to the proper quarter in Petersburg. Fortunately, it all passed over quickly and ended in nothing, but I was surprised at Stepan Trofimovich at the time. 3 years later, as everyone knows, people were beginning to talk of nationalism, and public opinion first came upon the scene. Stepan Trofimovich laughed a great deal. "My friends," he instructed us, "if our nationalism has dawned as they keep repeating in the papers, it's still at school, at some German Peterschule, sitting over a German book and repeating its everlasting German lesson, and its German teacher will make it go down on its knees when he thinks fit. I think highly of the German teacher. But nothing has happened and nothing of the kind has dawned, and everything is going on in the old way, that is, as ordained by God. To my thinking that should be enough for Russia, pour Notre Saint Russie. Besides, all this slavism and nationalism is too old to be new. Nationalism, if you like, has never existed among us except as a distraction for gentlemen's clubs, and Moscow ones at that. I'm not talking of the days of Igor, of course. And besides, it all comes of idleness. Everything in Russia comes of idleness, everything good and fine even. It all springs from the charming, cultured, whimsical idleness of our gentry. I'm ready to repeat it for 30,000 years. We don't know how to live by our own labor. And as for the fuss they're making now about the dawn of some sort of public opinion, has it so suddenly dropped from heaven without any warning? How is it they don't understand that before we can have an opinion of our own we must have work, our own initiative in things, our own experience? Nothing is to be gained for nothing. If we work, we shall have an opinion of our own. But as we never shall work, our opinions will be formed for us by those who have hitherto done the work instead of us, that is, as always, Europe, the everlasting Germans, our teachers for the last 2 centuries. Moreover, Russia is too big a tangle for us to unravel alone without the Germans, and without hard work. For the last 20 years I've been sounding the alarm, and the summons to work. I'd given up my life to that appeal, and, in my folly, I put faith in it. Now I have lost faith in it, but I sound the alarm still, and shall sound it to the tomb. I will pull at the bell ropes until they toll for my own requiem. Alas! We could do nothing but assent. We applauded our teacher, and with what warmth, indeed! And, after all, my friends, don't we still hear today, every hour, at every step, the same charming, clever, liberal, old Russian nonsense? Our teacher believed in God. I can't understand why they make me out an infidel here, he used to say sometimes. I believe in God, mais distinguens, I believe in him as a being who is conscious of himself in me only. I cannot believe as my Nastasia, the servant, or like some country gentleman who believes to be on the safe side, or like our dear Shadov, but no, Shadov doesn't come into it. Shadov believes on principle, like a Moscow Slavophil. As for Christianity, for all my genuine respect for it, I'm not a Christian. I am more of an antique pagan, like the great Goethe, or like an ancient Greek. The very fact that Christianity has failed to understand woman is enough, as George Sand has so splendidly shown in one of her great novels. As for the bowings, fasting, and all the rest of it, I don't understand what they have to do with me. However busy the informers may be here, I don't care to become a Jesuit. In the year 1847 Bylensky, who was abroad, sent his famous letter to Gogol, and warmly reproached him for believing in some sort of God. Entre nous soit dit, I can imagine nothing more comic than the moment when Gogol, the Gogol of that period, read that phrase, and the whole letter. But dismissing the humorous aspect, and, as I am fundamentally in agreement, I point to them and say these were men. They knew how to love their people, they knew how to suffer for them, they knew how to sacrifice everything for them, yet they knew how to differ from them when they ought, and did not filch certain ideas from them. Could Bylensky have sought salvation in Lenten oil, or peas with radish, but at this point Shadov interposed. Those men of yours never loved the people, they didn't suffer for them, and didn't sacrifice anything for them, though they may have amused themselves by imagining it, he growled sullenly, looking down, and moving impatiently in his chair. They didn't love the people, yelled Stepan Trofimovich. Oh, how they loved Russia! Neither Russia nor the people. Shadov yelled too, with flashing eyes. You can't love what you don't know, and they had no conception of the Russian people. All of them peered at the Russian people through their fingers, and you do too, Bylensky especially, from that very letter to Gogol one can see it. Bylensky, like the inquisitive man in Krylov's fable, did not notice the elephant in the Museum of Curiosities, but concentrated his whole attention on the French socialist beetles. He did not get beyond them. And yet perhaps he was cleverer than any of you. You've not only overlooked the people, you've taken up an attitude of disgusting contempt for them, if only because you could not imagine any but the French people, the Parisians indeed, and were ashamed that the Russians were not like them. That's the naked truth. And he who has no people has no God. You may be sure that all who cease to understand their own people and lose their connection with them at once lose to the same extent the faith of their fathers, and become atheistic or indifferent. I'm speaking the truth. This is a fact which will be realized. That's why all of you and all of us now are either beastly atheists or careless, dissolute imbeciles, and nothing more. And you too, Stepan Trofimovich, I don't make an exception of you at all. In fact, it is on your account I am speaking, let me tell you that. As a rule, after uttering such monologues, which happened to him pretty frequently, Shatov snatched up his cap and rushed to the door, in the full conviction that everything was now over, and that he had cut short all friendly relations with Stepan Trofimovich forever. But the latter always succeeded in stopping him in time. Hadn't we better make it up, Shatov, after all these endearments, he would say, benignly holding out his hand to him from his armchair. Shatov, clumsy and bashful, disliked sentimentality. Externally he was rough, but inwardly, I believe, he had great delicacy. Although he often went too far, he was the first to suffer for it. Muttering something between his teeth in response to Stepan Trofimovich's appeal, and shuffling with his feet like a bear, he gave a sudden and unexpected smile, put down his cap, and sat down in the same chair as before, with his eyes stubbornly fixed on the ground. Wine was, of course, brought in, and Stepan Trofimovich proposed some suitable toast, for instance the memory of some leading man of the past. There was another being in the world to whom Varvara Petrovna was as much attached as she was to Stepan Trofimovich, her only son, Nikolai Stavrogin. It was to undertake his education that Stepan Trofimovich had been engaged. The boy was at that time 8 years old, and his frivolous father, General Stavrogin, was already living apart from Varvara Petrovna, so that the child grew up entirely in his mother's care. To do Stepan Trofimovich justice, he knew how to win his pupil's heart. The whole secret of this lay in the fact that he was a child himself. I was not there in those days, and he continually felt the want of a real friend. He did not hesitate to make a friend of this little creature as soon as he had grown a little older. It somehow came to pass quite naturally that there seemed to be no discrepancy of age between them. More than once he awaked his 10 or 11-year-old friend at night, simply to pour out his wounded feelings and weep before him, or to tell him some family secret, without realizing that this was an outrageous proceeding. They threw themselves into each other's arms and wept. The boy knew that his mother loved him very much, but I doubt whether he cared much for her. She talked little to him and did not often interfere with him, but he was always morbidly conscious of her intent, searching eyes fixed upon him. Yet the mother confided his whole instruction and moral education to Stepan Trofimovich. At that time her faith in him was unshaken. One can't help believing that the tutor had rather a bad influence on his pupil's nerves. When at 16 he was taken to a lyceum he was fragile-looking and pale, strangely quiet and dreamy. Later on he was distinguished by great physical strength. One must assume too that the friends went on weeping at night, throwing themselves in each other's arms, though their tears were not always due to domestic difficulties. Stepan Trofimovich succeeded in reaching the deepest chords in his pupil's heart, and had aroused in him a vague sensation of that eternal, sacred yearning which some elect souls can never give up for cheap gratification when once they have tasted and known it. There are some connoisseurs who prize this yearning more than the most complete satisfaction of it, if such were possible. But in any case it was just as well that the pupil and the preceptor were, though none too soon, parted. For the first 2 years the lad used to come home from the lyceum for the holidays. While Varvara Petrovna and Stepan Trofimovich were staying in Petersburg he was sometimes present at the literary evenings at his mother's. He listened and looked on. He spoke little, and was quiet and shy as before. His manner to Stepan Trofimovich was as affectionately attentive as ever, but there was a shade of reserve in it. He unmistakably avoided distressing, lofty subjects or reminiscences of the past. By his mother's wish he entered the army on completing the school course, and soon received a commission in one of the most brilliant regiments of the Horse Guards. He did not come to show himself to his mother in his uniform, and his letters from Petersburg began to be infrequent. Varvara Petrovna sent him money without stint, though after the emancipation the revenue from her estate was so diminished that at first her income was less than half what it had been before. She had, however, a considerable sum laid by through years of economy. She took great interest in her son's success in the highest Petersburg society. Where she had failed, the wealthy young officer with expectation succeeded. He renewed acquaintances which she had hardly dared to dream of, and was welcomed everywhere with pleasure. But very soon rather strange rumors reached Varvara Petrovna. The young man had suddenly taken to riotous living with a sort of frenzy. Not that he gambled or drank too much, there was only talk of savage recklessness, of running over people in the street with his horses, of brutal conduct to a lady of good society with whom he had a liaison and whom he afterwards publicly insulted. There was a callous nastiness about this affair. It was added, too, that he had developed into a regular bully, insulting people for the mere pleasure of insulting them. Varvara Petrovna was greatly agitated and distressed. Stepan Trofimovich assured her that this was only the first riotous effervescence of a too richly endowed nature, that the storm would subside and that this was only like the youth of Prince Harry, who caroused with Falstaff, Poins, and Mrs. Quickly, as described by Shakespeare. This time Varvara Petrovna did not cry out, "Nonsense, nonsense," as she was very apt to do in later years in response to Stepan Trofimovich. On the contrary, she listened very eagerly, asked him to explain this theory more exactly, took up Shakespeare herself and with great attention read the immortal chronicle. But it did not comfort her, and indeed she did not find the resemblance very striking. With feverish impatience she awaited answers to some of her letters. She had not long to wait for them. The fatal news soon reached her that Prince Harry had been involved in 2 duels almost at once, was entirely to blame for both of them, had killed one of his adversaries on the spot and had maimed the other and was awaiting his trial in consequence. The case ended in his being degraded to the ranks, deprived of the rights of a nobleman, and transferred to an infantry line regiment, and he only escaped worse punishment by special favor. In 1863 he somehow succeeded in distinguishing himself, he received a cross, was promoted to be a non-commissioned officer, and rose rapidly to the rank of an officer. During this period Varvara Petrovna dispatched perhaps hundreds of letters to the capital, full of prayers and supplications. She even stooped to some humiliation in this extremity. After his promotion the young man suddenly resigned his commission, but he did not come back to Skvoreshniki again, and gave up writing to his mother altogether. They learned by roundabout means that he was back in Petersburg, but that he was not to be met in the same society as before. He seemed to be in hiding. They found out that he was living in strange company, associating with the dregs of the population of Petersburg, with slipshod government clerks, discharged military men, beggars of the higher class, and drunkards of all sorts, that he visited their filthy families, spent days and nights in dark slums and all sorts of low haunts, that he had sunk very low, that he was in rags, and that apparently he liked it. He did not ask his mother for money, he had his own little estate, once the property of his father, General Stavrogin, which yielded at least some revenue, and which, it was reported, he had let to a German from Saxony. At last his mother besought him to come to her, and Prince Harry made his appearance in our town. I had never set eyes on him before, but now I got a very distinct impression of him. He was a very handsome young man of 25, and I must own I was impressed by him. I had expected to see a dirty ragamuffin, sodden with drink and debauchery. He was on the contrary, the most elegant gentleman I had ever met, extremely well dressed, with an air and manner only to be found in a man accustomed to culture and refinement. I was not the only person surprised. It was a surprise to all the townspeople to whom, of course, young Stavrogin's whole biography was well known in its minutest details, though one could not imagine how they had got hold of them, and, what was still more surprising, half of their stories about him turned out to be true. All our ladies were wild over the new visitor. They were sharply divided into 2 parties, one of which adored him while the other half regarded him with a hatred that was almost bloodthirsty, but both were crazy about him. Some of them were particularly fascinated by the idea that he had perhaps a fateful secret hidden in his soul, others were positively delighted at the fact that he was a murderer. It appeared too that he had had a very good education and was indeed a man of considerable culture. No great acquirements were needed, of course, to astonish us. But he could judge also of very interesting everyday affairs, and, what was of the utmost value, he judged of them with remarkable good sense. I must mention as a peculiar fact that almost from the first day we all of us thought him a very sensible fellow. He was not very talkative, he was elegant without exaggeration, surprisingly modest, and at the same time bold and self-reliant, as none of us were. Our dandies gazed at him with envy, and were completely eclipsed by him. His face, too, impressed me. His hair was of a peculiarly intense black, his light-colored eyes were peculiarly light and calm, his complexion was peculiarly soft and white, the red in his cheeks was too bright and clear, his teeth were like pearls, and his lips like coral. One would have thought that he must be a paragon of beauty, yet at the same time there seemed something repellent about him. It was said that his face suggested a mask. So much was said though, among other things they talked of his extraordinary physical strength. He was rather tall. Varvara Petrovna looked at him with pride, yet with continual uneasiness. He spent about 6 months among us, listless, quiet, rather morose. He made his appearance in society, and with unfailing propriety performed all the duties demanded by our provincial etiquette. He was related, on his father's side, to the governor, and was received by the latter as a near kinsman. But a few months passed and the wild beast showed his claws. I may observe by the way, in parenthesis, that Ivan Osipovich, our dear mild governor, was rather like an old woman, though he was of good family and highly connected, which explains the fact that he remained so long among us, though he steadily avoided all the duties of his office. From his munificence and hospitality, he ought rather to have been a marshal of nobility of the good old days than a governor in such busy times as ours. It was always said in the town that it was not he, but Varvara Petrovna who governed the province. Of course this was said sarcastically, however, it was certainly a falsehood. And, indeed, much wit was wasted on the subject among us. On the contrary, in later years, Varvara Petrovna purposely and consciously withdrew from anything like a position of authority, and, in spite of the extraordinary respect in which she was held by the whole province, voluntarily confined her influence within strict limits set up by herself. Instead of these higher responsibilities she suddenly took up the management of her estate, and, within 2 or 3 years, raised the revenue from it almost to what it had yielded in the past. Giving up her former romantic impulses, trips to Petersburg, plans for founding a magazine, and so on, she began to be careful and to save money. She kept even Stepan Trofimovich at a distance, allowing him to take lodgings in another house, a change for which he had long been worrying her under various pretexts. Little by little Stepan Trofimovich began to call her a prosaic woman, or more jestingly, my prosaic friend. I need hardly say he only ventured on such jests in an extremely respectful form and on rare, and carefully chosen, occasions. All of us in her intimate circle felt, Stepan Trofimovich more acutely than any of us, that her son had come to her almost, as it were, as a new hope, and even as a sort of new aspiration. Her passion for her son dated from the time of his successes in Petersburg society, and grew more intense from the moment that he was degraded in the army. Yet she was evidently afraid of him, and seemed like a slave in his presence. It could be seen that she was afraid of something vague and mysterious, which she could not have put into words, and she often stole searching glances at Nicholas, scrutinizing him reflectively, and behold, the wild beast suddenly showed his claws. Suddenly, apropos of nothing, our prince was guilty of incredible outrages upon various persons and, what was most striking, these outrages were utterly unheard of, quite inconceivable, unlike anything commonly done, utterly silly and mischievous, quite unprovoked and objectless. One of the most respected of our club members, on our committee of management, Fyodor Pavlovich Gaganov, an elderly man of high rank in the service, had formed the innocent habit of declaring vehemently on all sorts of occasions, "No, you can't lead me by the nose." Well, there is no harm in that. But one day at the club, when he brought out this phrase in connection with some heated discussion in the midst of a little group of members, all persons of some consequence, Nikolai Stavrogin, who was standing on one side, alone and unnoticed, suddenly went up to Fyodor Pavlovich, took him unexpectedly and firmly with 2 fingers by the nose, and succeeded in leading him 2 or 3 steps across the room. He could have had no grudge against Mr. Gaganov. It might be thought to be a mere schoolboy prank, though, of course, a most unpardonable one. Yet, describing it afterwards, people said that he looked almost dreamy at the very instant of the operation, as though he had gone out of his mind, but that was recalled and reflected upon long afterwards. In the excitement of the moment all they recalled was the minute after, when he certainly saw it all as it really was, and far from being confused smiled gaily and maliciously without the slightest regret. There was a terrific outcry, he was surrounded. Nikolai Stavrogin kept turning round, looking about him, answering nobody, and glancing curiously at the persons exclaiming around him. At last he seemed suddenly, as it were, to sink into thought again, so at least it was reported, frowned, went firmly up to the affronted Pyotr Pavlovitch, and with evident vexation said in a rapid mutter, "You must forgive me, of course. I really don't know what suddenly came over me, it's silly." The carelessness of his apology was almost equivalent to a fresh insult. The outcry was greater than ever. Nikolai Stavrogin shrugged his shoulders and went away. All this was very stupid, to say nothing of its gross indecency. A calculated and premeditated indecency as it seemed at first sight, and therefore a premeditated and utterly brutal insult to our whole society. So it was taken to be by everyone. We began by promptly and unanimously striking young Stavrogin's name off the list of club members. Then it was decided to send an appeal in the name of the whole club to the governor, begging him at once, without waiting for the case to be formally tried in court, to use the administrative power entrusted to him to restrain this dangerous ruffian, this dueling bully from the capital, and so protect the tranquility of all the gentry of our town from injurious encroachments. It was added with angry resentment that a law might be found to control even Mr. Stavrogin. This phrase was prepared by way of a thrust at the governor on account of Varvara Petrovna. They elaborated it with relish. As ill luck would have it, the governor was not in the town at the time. He had gone to a little distance to stand godfather to the child of a very charming lady, recently left a widow in an interesting condition. But it was known that he would soon be back. In the meanwhile, they got up a regular ovation for the respected and insulted gentleman, people embraced and kissed him, the whole town called upon him. It was even proposed to give a subscription dinner in his honor, and they only gave up the idea at his earnest request, reflecting possibly at last that the man had, after all, been pulled by the nose and that was really nothing to congratulate him upon. Yet, how had it happened? How could it have happened? It is remarkable that no one in the whole town put down this savage act to madness. They must have been predisposed to expect such actions from Nikolai Stavrogin, even when he was sane. For my part, one don't know to this day how to explain it, in spite of the event that quickly followed and apparently explained everything, and conciliated everyone. I will add also that, for years later, in reply to a discreet question from me about the incident at the club, Nikolai Stavrogin answered, frowning, "I wasn't quite well at the time. But there is no need to anticipate events." The general outburst of hatred with which everyone fell upon the ruffian and dueling bully from the capital also struck me as curious. They insisted on seeing an insolent design and deliberate intention to insult our whole society at once. The truth was no one liked the fellow, but, on the contrary, he had set everyone against him, and one wonders how. Up to the last incident he had never quarreled with anyone, nor insulted anyone, but was as courteous as a gentleman at a fashion plate, if only the latter were able to speak. I imagine that he was hated for his pride. Even our ladies, who had begun by adoring him, railed against him now more loudly than the men. Varvara Petrovna was dreadfully overwhelmed. She confessed afterwards to Stepan Trofimovitch that she had had a foreboding of all this long before, that every day for the last 6 months she had been expecting just something of that sort, a remarkable admission on the part of his own mother. "It's begun," she thought to herself with a shudder. The morning after the incident at the club, she cautiously but firmly approached the subject with her son, but the poor woman was trembling all over in spite of her firmness. She had not slept all night and even went out early to Stepan Trofimovitch's lodgings to ask his advice, and shed tears there, a thing which she had never been known to do before anyone. She longed for Nicholas to say something to her, to deign to give some explanation. Nikolai, who was always so polite and respectful to his mother, listened to her for some time scowling, but very seriously. He suddenly got up without saying a word, kissed her hand and went away. That very evening, as though by design, he perpetrated another scandal. It was of a more harmless and ordinary character than the first. Yet, owing to the state of the public mind, it increased the outcry in the town. Our friend Liputin turned up and called on Nikolai Stavrogin immediately after the latter's interview with his mother, and earnestly begged for the honor of his company at a little party he was giving for his wife's birthday that evening. Varvara Petrovna had long watched with a pang at her heart her son's taste for such low company, but she had not dared to speak of it to him. He had made several acquaintances besides Liputin in the third rank of our society, and even in lower depths, he had a propensity for making such friends. He had never been in Liputin's house before, though he had met the man himself. He guessed that Liputin's invitation now was the consequence of the previous day's scandal, and that as a local liberal he was delighted at the scandal, genuinely believing that that was the proper way to treat stewards at the club, and that it was very well done. Nikolai Stavrogin smiled and promised to come. A great number of guests had assembled. The company was not very presentable, but very sprightly. Liputin, vain and envious, only entertained visitors twice a year, but on those occasions he did it without stint. The most honored of the invited guests, Stepan Trofimovich, was prevented by illness from being present. Tea was handed, and there were refreshments and vodka in plenty. Cards were played at 3 tables, and while waiting for supper the young people got up a dance. Nikolai Stavrogin led out Madame Liputin, a very pretty little woman who was dreadfully shy of him, took 2 turns round the room with her, sat down beside her, drew her into conversation and made her laugh. Noticing at last how pretty she was when she laughed, he suddenly, before all the company, seized her round the waist and kissed her on the lips 2 or 3 times with great relish. The poor frightened lady fainted. Nikolai Stavrogin took his hat and went up to the husband, who stood petrified in the middle of the general excitement. Looking at him he, too, became confused and muttering hurriedly, "Don't be angry," went away. Liputin ran after him in the entry, gave him his fur coat with his own hands, and saw him down the stairs, bowing. But next day a rather amusing sequel followed this comparatively harmless prank, a sequel from which Liputin gained some credit, and of which he took the fullest possible advantage. At 10 o'clock in the morning Liputin's servant Agafya, an easy-mannered, lively, rosy-cheeked peasant woman of 30, made her appearance at Stavrogin's house, with a message for Nikolai Stavrogin. She insisted on seeing His Honor himself. He had a very bad headache, but he went out. Varvara Petrovna succeeded in being present when the message was given. "Sergei Vasilyevich," Liputin's name, Agafya rattled off briskly, "bade me first of all give you his respectful greetings and ask after your health, what sort of night your honor spent after yesterday's doings, and how your honor feels now after yesterday's doings." Nikolai Stavrogin smiled. "Give him my greetings and thank him, and tell your master from me, Agafya, that he's the most sensible man in the town." And he told me to answer that. Agafya caught him up still more briskly, that he knows that without your telling him, and wishes you the same. "Really? But how could he tell what I should say to you?" "I can't say in what way he could tell, but when I had set off and had gone right down the street, I heard something, and there he was, running after me without his cap. I say, Agafya, if by any chance he says to you, 'Tell your master that he has more sense than all the town,' you tell him at once, 'Don't forget, the master himself knows that very well, and wishes you the same.'" At last the interview with the governor took place too. Our dear, mild, Ivan Osipovich had only just returned and only just had time to hear the angry complaint from the club. There was no doubt that something must be done, but he was troubled. The hospitable old man seemed also rather afraid of his young kinsman. He made up his mind, however, to induce him to apologize to the club and to his victim in satisfactory form, and, if required, by letter, and then to persuade him to leave us for a time, traveling, for instance, to improve his mind, in Italy, or in fact anywhere abroad. In the waiting-room in which on this occasion he received Nikolai Stavrogin, who had been at other times privileged as a relation to wander all over the house unchecked, Alyosha Telyatnikov, a clerk of refined manners, who was also a member of the governor's household, was sitting in a corner opening envelopes at a table, and in the next room, at the window nearest to the door, a stout and sturdy colonel, a former friend and colleague of the governor, was sitting alone reading the Golos. Paying no attention, of course, to what was taking place in the waiting-room, in fact, he had his back turned. Ivan Osipovich approached the subject in a roundabout way, almost in a whisper, but kept getting a little muddled. Nikolai looked anything but cordial, not at all as a relation should. He was pale and sat looking down and continually moving his eyebrows as though trying to control acute pain. you have a kind heart and a generous one, Nicholas," the old man put in among other things. "You're a man of great culture, you've grown up in the highest circles, and here too your behavior has hitherto been a model, which has been a great consolation to your mother, who is so precious to all of us. And now again everything has appeared in such an unaccountable light, so detrimental to all. I speak as a friend of your family, as an old man who loves you sincerely and a relation, at whose words you cannot take offense. Tell me, what drives you to such reckless proceedings so contrary to all accepted rules and habits? What can be the meaning of such acts which seem almost like outbreaks of delirium?" Nikolai listened with vexation and impatience. All at once there was a gleam of something sly and mocking in his eyes. "I'll tell you what drives me to it," he said sullenly, and looking round him he bent down to Ivan Osipovich's ear. The refined Alyosha Telyatnikov moved 3 steps farther away towards the window, and the colonel coughed over the gallows. Poor Ivan Osipovich hurriedly and trustfully inclined his ear. He was exceedingly curious. And then something utterly incredible, though on the other side only too unmistakable, took place. The old man suddenly felt that, instead of telling him some interesting secret, Nikolai had seized the upper part of his ear between his teeth and was nipping it rather hard. He shuddered, and breath failed him. "Nicholas, this is beyond a joke," he moaned mechanically in a voice not his own. Alyosha and the colonel had not yet grasped the situation, besides they couldn't see, and fancied up to the end that the two were whispering together, and yet the old man's desperate face alarmed them. They looked at one another with wide-open eyes, not knowing whether to rush to his assistance as agreed or to wait. Nikolai noticed this perhaps, and bit the harder. "Nicholas! Nicholas!" his victim moaned again. "Come, you've had your joke, that's enough." In another moment the poor governor would certainly have died of terror, but the monster had mercy on him, and let go his ear. The old man's deadly terror lasted for a full minute, and it was followed by a sort of fit. Within half an hour Nikolai was arrested and removed for the time to the guard-room, where he was confined in a special cell, with a special sentinel at the door. This decision was a harsh one, but our mild governor was so angry that he was prepared to take the responsibility even if he had to face Varvara Petrovna. To the general amazement, when this lady arrived at the governor's in haste and in nervous irritation to discuss the matter with him at once, she was refused admittance, whereupon, without getting out of the carriage, she returned home, unable to believe her senses. And at last everything was explained. At 2 o'clock in the morning the prisoner, who had till then been calm and had even slept, suddenly became noisy, began furiously beating on the door with his fists, with unnatural strength wrenched the iron grating off the door, broke the window, and cut his hands all over. When the officer on duty ran with a detachment of men and the keys and ordered the cell to be opened that they might rush in and bind the maniac, it appeared that he was suffering from acute brain fever. He was taken home to his mother. Everything was explained at once. All our 3 doctors gave it as their opinion that the patient might well have been in a delirious state for 3 days before, and that though he might have apparently been in possession of full consciousness and cunning, yet he might have been deprived of common sense and will, which was indeed borne out by the facts. So it turned out that Liputin had guessed the truth sooner than anyone. Ivan Osipovich, who was a man of delicacy and feeling, was completely abashed. But what was striking was that he, too, had considered Nikolai Vsyevolodovich capable of any mad action even when in the full possession of his faculties. At the club, too, people were ashamed and wondered how it was they had failed to see the elephant and had missed the only explanation of all these marvels. There were, of course, skeptics among them, but they could not long maintain their position. Nikolai was in bed for more than 2 months. A famous doctor was summoned from Moscow for a consultation. The whole town called on Varvara Petrovna. She forgave them. When in the spring Nikolai had completely recovered and assented without discussion to his mother's proposal that he should go for a tour to Italy, she begged him further to pay visits of farewell to all the neighbors, and so far as possible to apologize where necessary. Nikolai agreed with great alacrity. It became known at the club that he had had a most delicate explanation with Fyodor Pavlovich Gaganov at the house of the latter, who had been completely satisfied with his apology. As he went round to pay these calls, Nikolai was very grave and even gloomy. Everyone appeared to receive him sympathetically, but everybody seemed embarrassed and glad that he was going to Italy. Ivan Osipovich was positively tearful, but was, for some reason, unable to bring himself to embrace him, even at the final leave-taking. It is true that some of us retained the conviction that the scamp had simply been making fun of us, and that the illness was neither here nor there. He went to see Liputin too. "Tell me," he said, "how could you guess beforehand what I should say about your sense and primagaphia with an answer to it?" "Why," laughed Liputin, "it was because I recognized that you were a clever man, and so I foresaw what your answer would be. Anyway, it was a remarkable coincidence. But, excuse me, did you consider me a sensible man and not insane when you sent Agaphia? For the cleverest and most rational, and I only pretended to believe that you were insane. And you guessed at once what was in my mind, and sent a testimonial to my wit through Agaphia. Well, there you're a little mistaken." "I really was unwell," muttered Nikolai Stavrogin, frowning. "Bah," he cried, "do you suppose I'm capable of attacking people when I'm in my senses? What object would there be in it?" Liputin shrank together and didn't know what to answer. Nikolai turned pale or, at least, so it seemed to Liputin. "You have a very peculiar way of looking at things, anyhow," Nikolai went on, "but as for Agaphia, I understand, of course, that you simply sent her to be rude to me. I couldn't challenge you to a duel, could I?" "Oh, no, of course. I seem to have heard that you're not fond of duels." "Why borrow from the French?" said Liputin, doubling up again. "You're for nationalism, then?" Liputin shrank into himself more than ever. "Bah, bah. What do I see?" cried Nicholas, noticing a volume of Considerant in the most conspicuous place on the table. "You don't mean to say you're a Fourierist?" "I'm afraid you must be." "And isn't this too borrowing from the French?" He laughed, tapping the book with his finger. "No, that's not taken from the French," Liputin cried with positive fury, jumping up from his chair. "That is taken from the universal language of humanity, not simply from the French. From the language of the universal social republic and harmony of mankind, let me tell you. Not simply from the French." "Phoo! Hang it all! There's no such language," laughed Nikolai. "Sometimes a trifle will catch the attention and exclusively absorb it for a time. Most of what I have to tell of young Stavrogin will come later. But I will note now as a curious fact that of all the impressions made on him by his stay in our town, the one most sharply imprinted on his memory was the unsightly and almost abject figure of the little provincial official, the coarse and jealous family despot, the miserly moneylender who picked up the candle ends and scraps left from dinner, and was at the same time a passionate believer in some visionary future social harmony, who at night gloated in ecstasies over fantastic pictures of a future phalanstery, in the approaching realization of which, in Russia, and in our province, he believed as firmly as in his own existence. And that in the very place where he had saved up to buy himself a little home, where he had married for the second time, getting a dowry with his bride, where perhaps, for 100 miles round there was not one man, himself included, who was the very least like a future member of the universal human republic and social harmony. God knows how these people come to exist. Nikolai wondered, recalling sometimes the unlooked-for Fourierist. Our prince traveled for over 3 years, so that he was almost forgotten in the town. We learned from Stepan Trofimovich that he had traveled all over Europe, that he had even been in Egypt and had visited Jerusalem, and then had joined some scientific expedition to Iceland, and he actually did go to Iceland. It was reported too that he had spent one winter attending lectures in a German university. He did not write often to his mother, twice a year, or even less, but Varvara Petrovna was not angry or offended at this. She accepted submissively and without repining the relations that had been established once for all between her son and herself. She fretted for her Nicholas and dreamed of him continually. She kept her dreams and lamentations to herself. She seemed to have become less intimate even with Stepan Trofimovich. She was forming secret projects, and seemed to have become more careful about money than ever. She was more than ever given to saving money and being angry at Stepan Trofimovich's losses at cards. At last, in the April of this year, she received a letter from Paris from Praskovia Ivanovna Drozdov, the widow of the general and the friend of Varvara Petrovna's childhood. Praskovia Ivanovna, whom Varvara Petrovna had not seen or corresponded with for 8 years, wrote, informing her that Nikolai Stavrogin had become very intimate with them and a great friend of her only daughter, Liza, and that he was intending to accompany them to Switzerland, to Verney Montreux, though in the household of Count K., a very influential personage in Petersburg, who was now staying in Paris. He was received like a son of the family, so that he almost lived at the Count's. The letter was brief, and the object of it was perfectly clear, though it contained only a plain statement of the above-mentioned facts without drawing any inferences from them. Varvara Petrovna did not pause long to consider. She made up her mind instantly, made her preparations, and taking with her her protégée, Dasha, Shadov's sister, she set off in the middle of April for Paris, and from there went on to Switzerland. She returned in July, alone, leaving Dasha with the Drozdovs. She brought us the news that the Drozdovs themselves had promised to arrive among us by the end of August. The Drozdovs, too, were landowners of our province, but the official duties of General Ivan Ivanovich Drozdov, who had been a friend of Varvara Petrovna's and a colleague of her husband's, had always prevented them from visiting their magnificent estate. On the death of the general, which had taken place the year before, the inconsolable widow had gone abroad with her daughter, partly in order to try the grape cure which she proposed to carry out at Verney Montreux during the latter half of the summer. On their return to Russia, they intended to settle in our province for good. She had a large house in the town which had stood empty for many years, with the windows nailed up. They were wealthy people. Praskovia Ivanovna had been, in her first marriage, a Madame Tushin, and like her school friend, Varvara Petrovna, was the daughter of a government contractor of the old school, and she too had been an heiress at her marriage. Tushin, a retired cavalry captain, was also a man of means, and of some ability. At his death he left a snug fortune to his only daughter Liza, a child of 7. Now that Lizaveta Nikolaevna was 22, her private fortune might confidently be reckoned at 200,000 rubles, to say nothing of the property, which was bound to come to her at the death of her mother, who had no children by her second marriage. Varvara Petrovna seemed to be very well satisfied with her expedition. In her own opinion she had succeeded in coming to a satisfactory understanding with Praskovia Ivanovna, and immediately on her arrival she confided everything to Stepan Trofimovich. She was positively effusive with him as she had not been for a very long time. "Hurrah!" cried Stepan Trofimovich, and snapped his fingers. He was in a perfect rapture, especially as he had spent the whole time of his friend's absence in extreme dejection. On setting off, she had not even taken leave of him properly, and had said nothing of her plan to that old woman, dreading, perhaps, that he might chatter about it. She was cross with him at the time on account of a considerable gambling debt which she had suddenly discovered. But before she left Switzerland she had felt that on her return she must make up for it to her forsaken friend, especially as she had treated him very curtly for a long time past. Her abrupt and mysterious departure had made a profound and poignant impression on the timid heart of Stepan Trofimovich, and to make matters worse he was beset with other difficulties at the same time. He was worried by a very considerable money obligation, which had weighed upon him for a long time and which he could never hope to meet without Varvara Petrovna's assistance. Moreover, in the May of this year, the term of office of our mild and gentle Ivan Osipovich came to an end. He was superseded under rather unpleasant circumstances. Then, while Varvara Petrovna was still away, there followed the arrival of our new governor, Andrei Antonovich von Lemke, and with that a change began at once to be perceptible in the attitude of almost the whole of our provincial society towards Varvara Petrovna, and consequently towards Stepan Trofimovich. He had already had time anyway to make some disagreeable though valuable observations, and seemed very apprehensive alone without Varvara Petrovna. He had an agitating suspicion that he had already been mentioned to the governor as a dangerous man. He knew for a fact that some of our ladies meant to give up calling on Varvara Petrovna. Of our governor's wife, who was only expected to arrive in the autumn, it was reported that though she was, so it was heard, proud, she was a real aristocrat, and not like that poor Varvara Petrovna. Everybody seemed to know for a fact, and in the greatest detail, that our governor's wife and Varvara Petrovna had met already in society and had parted enemies, so that the mere mention of Madame von Lemke's name would, it was said, make a painful impression on Varvara Petrovna. The confident and triumphant air of Varvara Petrovna, the contemptuous indifference with which she heard of the opinions of our provincial ladies and the agitation in local society, revived the flagging spirits of Stepan Trofimovich and cheered him up at once. With peculiar, gleefully obsequious humor, he was beginning to describe the new governor's arrival. "You are no doubt aware, excellent Amy," he said, jauntily and coquettishly drawling his words, "what is meant by a Russian administrator, speaking generally, and what is meant by a new Russian administrator, that is the newly baked, newly established, CES interminables mos Russes. But I don't think you can know in practice what is meant by administrative ardor, and what sort of thing that is." Administrative ardor? I don't know what that is. Well, vous savez chez nous. NNMOT set the most insignificant non-entity to sell miserable tickets at a railway station, and the non-entity will at once feel privileged to look down on you like a Jupiter, pour mentir sans pouvoir when you go to take a ticket. "Now then," he says, "I shall show you my power," and in them it comes to a genuine, administrative ardor. NNMOT, I've read that some verger in one of our Russian churches abroad, mais c'est très curieux, literally drove a distinguished English family, les dames charmantes, out of the church before the beginning of the Lenten service, vous savez ces chances le livre de job, on the simple pretext that foreigners are not allowed to loaf about a Russian church, and that they must come at the time fixed. And he sent them into fainting fits. That verger was suffering from an attack of administrative ardor, et-il a mentir sans pouvoir. Cut it short if you can, Stepan Trofimovich. Mr. von Lemke is making a tour of the province now. NNMOT, this Andrei Antonovich, though he is a Russified German and of the Orthodox persuasion, and even, I will say that for him, a remarkably handsome man of about 40. What makes you think he's a handsome man? He has eyes like a sheep's. Precisely so. But in this I yield, of course, to the opinion of our ladies. Let's get on, Stepan Trofimovich, I beg you. By the way, you're wearing a red necktie. Is it long since you've taken to it? I've only put it on today. And do you take your constitutional? Do you go for a 4-mile walk every day as the doctor told you to? And not always. I knew you didn't. I felt sure of that when I was in Switzerland, she cried irritably. Now you must go not 4 but 6 miles a day. You've grown terribly slack, terribly, terribly. You're not simply getting old, you're getting decrepit. You shocked me when I first saw you just now, in spite of your red tie, Kelly de Rouge. Go on about von Lemke if you've really something to tell me, and do finish some time, I entreat you, I'm tired. NNMOT, I only wanted to say that he is one of those administrators who begin to have power at 40, who, till they're 40, have been stagnating in insignificance and then suddenly come to the front through suddenly acquiring a wife, or some other equally desperate means. That is, he has gone away now, that is, I mean to say, it was at once whispered in both his ears that I am a corrupter of youth, and a hotbed of provincial atheism. He began making inquiries at once. Is that true? I took steps about it, in fact. When he was informed that you ruled the province, vous savez, he allowed himself to use the expression that there shall be nothing of that sort in the future. Did he say that? That there shall be nothing of the sort in future, and, avec cette morgue. His wife, Yulia Mihailovna, we shall behold at the end of August, she's coming straight from Petersburg. From abroad. We met there. Vraiment? In Paris and in Switzerland. She's related to the Drostovs. Related? What an extraordinary coincidence. They say she is ambitious and supposed to have great connections. Nonsense. Connections indeed. She was an old maid without a farthing till she was 45. But now she's hooked her von Lemke, and, of course, her whole object is to push him forward. They're both intriguers. And they say she's 2 years older than he is? 5. Her mother used to wear out her skirts on my doorsteps in Moscow. She used to beg for an invitation to our balls as a favor when my husband was living. And this creature used to sit all night alone in a corner without dancing, with her turquoise fly on her forehead, so that simply from pity I used to have to send her her first partner at 2 o'clock in the morning. She was 25 then, and they used to rig her out in short skirts like a little girl. It was improper to have them about at last. I seem to see that fly. I tell you, as soon as I arrived I was in the thick of an intrigue. You read Madame Drozdov's letter, of course. What could be clearer? What did I find? That fool Praskovia herself, she always was a fool, looked at me as much as to ask why I'd come. You can fancy how surprised I was. I looked round, and there was that Lemka woman at her tricks, and that cousin of hers, old Drozdov's nephew, it was all clear. You may be sure I changed all that in a twinkling, and Praskovia is on my side again, but what an intrigue! In which you came off victor, however. Bismarck. Without being a Bismarck, I'm equal to falseness and stupidity wherever I meet it, falseness, and Praskovia's folly. I don't know when I've met such a flabby woman, and what's more her legs are swollen, and she's a good-natured simpleton, too. What can be more foolish than a good-natured simpleton? A spiteful fool, ma bonne amie, a spiteful fool is still more foolish, Stepan Trofimovich protested magnanimously. You're right, perhaps. Do you remember Liza? Charmante enfant. But she's not an enfant now, but a woman, and a woman of character. She's a generous, passionate creature, and what I like about her, she stands up to that confiding fool, her mother. There was almost a row over that cousin.